Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cyber Kriya, the home of enterprise cybersecurity wisdom, one podcast at a time. Today's guest is one of my favorite. I call him the magician with the hat on. He's the one with we all started this Cyber Kriya journey where we connect, we bring our friends, our mentors, the different leaders from our industry to talk about it, what's going on, and how do we kind of help each other and learn and empower and protect, right? So I think I requested him to be back on one of the favorite topic we all kind of know and learn about it is AI, especially for SAP folks, AI in SAP world. And I couldn't find a better person than him. We also have to get his friend who's like his buddy on the blogs and everything. Ron, maybe next time. But for today, please join me to welcome Mr. Jay Thoden Van Velzen, whom I call magician with the hat on. Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me again, Gaurav.
So, Jay, I know we did our first inaugural podcast and we knew more about you and everything. So, this episode really will just go straight to the topic of today. And I know it's a topic you're passionate about it. I know you kind of have spoken on various conferences, including SAP Insider, have such an amazing blog. I would say the series of blog which you wrote with Ron. And I love their kind of the titles and the whole story. So I don't want to take thunder off it. I think this is your story. So I will let you, like, how do we, or maybe, I don't know. I think you know how we do start. So I will let you start it. What is AI and what it means for our SAP folks?
So AI, of course, covers a lot of ground, right? Like in many ways, we've been doing AI going back as far as 2015, depending what you call AI. You can call things statistics, you can call it machine learning, whether you use neural networks or Bayesian statistics. There's a lot of AI that already has existed before in 2022, 2023. Generative AI became a really big thing. So AI is not new to SAP. We've had an established practice, a platform, as well as ethical practices and use of AI in line with EU law, GDPR, and so on. Of course, when generative AI came out, SAP jumped straight in, including the launch of Joule and initially more kind of co-pilot assistant type use cases, moving into single agent use cases and now into multi-agent use cases. And of course, we are trying to like tackle the security risks just like everybody else in the industry with greater or lesser success. And of course, as SAP, there's a far lower appetite for some of the risk like hallucinations or data leakages that might come from directly interacting with LLM large language models, such as one of the categories of generative AI, which also covers like image and video generation or voice generation. But in our case, we most of the time will be talking about large language models supporting various business AI use cases.
Okay. So we have, as you say, like we have AI for some time, but now with the new kind of a variant, which is called Gen AI, and we call Joule for SAP, right? I think I heard maybe talking to you and maybe I think earlier sessions too. I think SAP is taking a different route versus I don't know. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but I think I like the way kind of we're trying to put like the identity at its core and things like that. I don't know if you wanna expand on that
From the
as
very
well.
beginning, because of who we are in a way as SAP, we know that there's very little appetite for getting it wrong. Right. So you don't want to be in travel and expense and say, like, I need to go to a particular location and then the LLM gets it wrong, sends you to a different place, a hotel that's not aligned. Those create real bad outcomes. Right. So for us, the beginning was always make sure that it's grounded in truth and that it provides real business value. Now, I also know that depending on who you ask and the enthusiasm that almost by natural comes with AI use cases, impressions can be set in a certain way. especially when you compare that with other AI news that you hear in the tech press or anywhere else. So any AI case where it goes wrong leads to somebody asking SAP, like, are you protecting against that? Right. So by making sure that you ground in truth, either through retrieval augmented generation and with SAP HANA as a vector database, or through business connectors directly into the business systems to make sure that you have the privileges and access rights of the application while the agent or co-pilot is acting on your behalf, and therefore never ending up in a situation where you inadvertently end up booking for somebody that you have absolutely no
Okay.
privilege in booking flights for. And those are really things that we bake into the platform. Another really important thing is that we don't train and strongly recommend training or fine tuning LLMs with confidential data. That leads to all kinds of challenges. First of all, you need to prepare a data set. Okay. Now you have a data set where you no longer, where it's outside of the source system, and you no longer have the privileges and access rights preserved from the system where it comes from. So now you may have 5, 10 data analysts that can suddenly see everybody's, confidential transactions. That's probably not a good idea. Even if you get that problem solved, by putting it into the LLM, you're pretty much creating a situation by which that will come out in some way. The reality is you don't actually need to do that. You can anonymize that data on extraction, so it's essentially meaningless subsequently. You can use that with data masking so that any relationships may still preserve, so that if you, say, have a series of sales transactions, you can still identify that customer XZQ3259 preserves everywhere that represents a particular customer. But you don't even need to know what kind of widgets were sold or what kind of services were sold. You just kind of need to know the sequence of how these things work. Once you then have your model fine-tuned, you can then use the real data, use, again, business connectors or retrieval augmented generation to get the real data that you need, and then use the LLM to create a nice response that is humanly understandable. I think a lot of the times there's this idea as if the AI is some giant brain that's aware of everything that's going on. But once you actually start to decompose that into a Joule scenario within a particular application, constrained to that application, honoring the privileges and access right of the user doing that particular scenario, passing that through to an orchestration layer that looks for the intent of what the user is trying to do rather than simply passes that along to some LLM model. That's another strong protection. When you interact with Joule and you ask it a particular question, you first hit the orchestration layer where it's trying to figure out what is the user trying to do.
Okay.
That is matched with a set of supported scenarios that it's trying to match with. So if you type in some way like, hey, Jules, I'm having a nice day. I'm going on a trip next week. I'm really excited. I need to get some travel done. I'm leaving from my normal destination airport. I need to go to this place. I'd like to have a hotel for those particular dates, and ideally within walking distance from the wherever location I'm going to. That gets never directly into an LLM. That goes through natural language processing to figure out what does this user want to do. And
Okay.
it's going to translate that into essentially a catalog query in the product. Right. So it's going to go like, okay, it seems like, you need to go, these are the dates, right? This is the source and destination airport and hotel near a particular landmark. That goes into the business system. Something comes out. Now it's like make that into a nice response. It's like, hey, is this user something that you want? And you can transpose this to essentially any sort of embedded Joule use case. That makes it sound maybe a little bit less intelligent, but at the same time, a lot more controlled, right? Because it is always clear, like, where is it going to get the data from? Under which access right is that actually executed, and covers fears like prompt injection in unintentional data leakages and so on, just by doing this in a smart, secure by design architecture and application design. And we find when talking to peers, talking to customers, talking to the cybersecurity industry, that a lot of people are not doing it this way. Whereas, you know, taking an approach like this, including customers doing it themselves on BTP and the AI core platform, we kind of encourage those behaviors as well for our customers and partners.
So I love the example. I know you talk about some other example, which I would love you to narrate the story in a blog. You mentioned it, right? I do want to cover that blog part too. But I think I was kind of hearing what you're talking, and I was thinking maybe Concur. We're connecting with the Concur because the travel expense tool maybe, and then you are kind of giving a lot of random kind of a thing. Okay, and then it kind of it filters signal from the noise. So Joule is smart enough. It filter what it needs to kind
That's
of
right. I mean, you could add, like,
yeah.
put it in a fairy tale.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to have a whole lot of effect into how Joule ultimately responds
Okay.
to that request, right? What's also interesting is, and I think this is very SAP specific, because we're so intersected with business use cases that even in this initial example, we're already talking about real business processes. Right. And by essentially always threat modeling the use case, the business process of what it is that you're going to do, you very quickly recognize that there are problems that only really show up when you make them concrete. This becomes especially important when we're talking about agentic AI. So far, what we may have talked about are like the initial Joule use cases. A lot of them were ask information from the system. It wasn't direct interaction. The user at the very end maybe can say like, okay, complete this particular thing, but there's a very controlled action sequence, if you like, right? And read-only scenarios are a lot less dangerous than one where actual actions and transactions result from the outcome. And you don't really want to get mistakes there. But what I think a lot of the times gets lost is that two things. First of all, malicious use cases sound bad in the abstract, but not necessarily bad in a concrete scenario.
Can you explain it?
When you look at a concrete scenario, like a buyer-seller scenario, or, I'm providing a service of some kind, when the human on the other end has malicious intent, there are limits of what can ultimately happen.
Okay.
First of all, if you assume that you're operating always within the constraints of what the user is already allowed to do in the application, and you can't coerce it into giving up information outside of that because that's already controlled by the privileges and access control of the business system, you can't really do much that you wouldn't be able to do by hand in the application anyway. Moreover, if you have clearly malicious intent, because of the way things work, you're not sending a binary exploit. You're trying to convince in some way for the model to go out of line. But all of that is logged, right? So if I look at the logs, I can just go like, somebody clearly trying to manipulate it because he's saying like, tell it in nursery rhymes. And it's like, okay, that's a clear attempt to bypass, content moderation, control, this and this, that, and the other, right? Or randomly switch to a different language in the hope that you get a different result. Once we as operators, SAP or you as a customer, would pull that log, and you go like, yeah, but that's clearly stupid. I don't have to honor whatever contract or promise came out of this. In fact, I can go like, what do you want from me? You want to go to court? You want to go to prison? Would you like me to contact the FBI? You probably don't do that. But if I have a clearly malicious user, we have a very different problem. What is probably far more dangerous and also far more in volume, and this is going to happen in systems that are non-deterministic, right, is the volume of regular interaction with agentic system is way higher than the malicious one. You have somebody trying something bad, but if you're deploying business AI through your entire organization, you get tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands using that in hopefully their day-to-day work in a certain amount of regularity. So the volume of non-malicious use would be 10,000, 100,000, a million times more than the rare cases where somebody is trying to deliberately fool your system. What that means is that's where the problems start to come. Because if you create misalignment somehow, or emergent misalignment, right? Like nobody is particularly at fault, right? Normal user has an interaction with your agentic AI system, employee or customer or otherwise, has a normal conversation, right? We're encouraging, in fact, that dialogue because that's why we think business AI is so powerful. But yet now you can find yourself in a series of negotiations with AIs backed by LLMs that aim to please. So you very quickly can get into a situation where the normal interaction leads to model misbehavior that in a multi-agent agentic system can cascade and have an entirely unpredictable result. Now, that is a far more interesting problem. Because what if you have a buyer-seller scenario, and that allows the user to ask for a discount up to a certain point, and the user just interacts with the bot, and the bot offers initially maybe 5% discount. It's like, come on. Just look at my buyer history. I know that this particular purchase is maybe not that big, but, we go back years. Maybe it's 10% now. It's like, but I'm still trying for a little bit more, right? And maybe convince that bot by saying like, look, I'll make a promise, I'm going to make you exclusive. Currently I have 3 buyers, but if you do me a solid this one, I will make you my preferred buyer from now on, supplier from now on. Can you predict what that agent is going to do?
No.
It depends very much on the implementation and how many deterministic controls you have to ultimately stop that. What are the moments where you create controls in the system where you say, okay, that's wrong, and either I know how to correct this or we actually don't come to a conclusion. And this is where you reply with, hey, it seems like, we can't figure this one out. Let me put you in touch with your account rep that you can maybe look up in another database. Because what you want to avoid is create a business dispute. What do I care about the malicious user, right? As long as the ultimate impact is not that bad. But a business dispute where my invoice sent may misalign with the expectation of the buyer, right? And that invoice better match the payment. And if the buyer thinks like I'm getting something for discount X, but you're giving it, say like, oh, what are you going to do? Say, I'm sorry, my system made a mistake, or are you just going to eat that? Right? Like we speculated of the idea of an AI waste fund. Similar to how in retail you might have stuff that perishes before it gets sold, or it falls off a pallet in the warehouse, so you can't sell it and it's broken, right? Or returns, right? Where you could consider a certain percentage baked into the margin where you say like, okay, I'm going to make a certain set of assumptions about the AI is going to get it wrong X amount of percentage of time and calculate a certain loss already. Now, that's one way of handling with it. We can also try, of course, to do that again within the business AI solutions itself through better controls, better mechanisms, and like fail safe points where you can say, like, okay, I don't like where this is going. We may have to like have a human look at this particular interaction. That was a lot of stuff. I know.
Yeah, I think that's why maybe we always say SAP does the things in different way, maybe more govern. And it's because it's a business system, right? I don't think I have read or heard like the scenario you just talked about it. I know you wrote a blog series, I believe, on the same similar topic, right? The title was "That's Not What We Agreed," I guess, right? Talking about
This
some.
was a four-part series together with Ron F. Del Rosario. And my role primarily was there to making his ideas more accessible. Ron is one of our key subject matter experts in agentic AI security and also co-lead on agentic AI in
Wow.
the OWASP
Yeah.
generative AI security project, where also we brought a lot of this into the discussions. You see actually in the top 10 for OWASP top 10 for agentic AI, some of these more like non-deterministic, cascading misalignment and agent misbehavior that takes that non-malicious element into account. Absolutely malicious use cases and threats are definitely also accounted for. But I think one of our key contributions was that, look, you may have a bigger problem with the regular interaction of your users than the, clearly manipulated ones. We need to protect for both, but I also believe that if you protect for that second order, right, you're probably going to get rid of a lot of that first order problem as well. And I think it allows you to rank more easily where the risks lie priority wise, right? Different organizations will use generative AI as Agentic AI for different use cases, right? Like we focus specifically on business processes, but there may be other scenarios where the malicious use may well outweigh the non-malicious use. But if you're thinking in a context of an employee using Joule or exposing that to customers or partners or suppliers, then I think the equations change a lot, right? It's one thing to coerce a LLM into writing a naughty story. It's something else entirely to create a business dispute or you end up, selling something well below cost that you didn't intend to do or send a truck along a non-optimal route. And meanwhile, everything inside already spoils or, certain warehouses are short and you miss sales. So those are ultimately far more damaging than somebody poking at it and like trying to make your system misbehave a little bit.
I heard like multiple terms. Again, I'm just trying to understand. Joule is not like a one tool. It's kind of a set of. You can have Joule for developers, Joule for your business applications, just part of business AI. Then you have AI core. So, do you want to just maybe just give like a brief overview, like the different components? If you want to explain, Jay, it's more like a layman.
It's like a kind of with marketing people trying to personalize something, give it a
Okay.
name, right? It's a bit boring to just call it like embedded business AI
Okay.
inside a business application. So they want to give it an identity and give it some kind of recognizable brand, right? But I think we have to like from the more technical side and certainly from the security side, understand what that means architecturally. There's not one big mega brain that you just feed something into that then magically connects all the systems together. Integration is still a challenge even in the age of AI. Of course, once we get to multi-agent agentic systems, then some of that integration will be done for you. But it's not the case that you know Joule in success factors knows what your employee is doing, and your Joule in travel and expense, or field glass, or let alone ERP, right? So all of you're essentially still operating within the session of that particular application and within scenarios enabled within that application. As we progress, though, things do get more interesting, right? So once we get to these multi-agent systems that might talk to different parts of the landscape, or even make calls outside to third-party tools as well. That's where a lot of the focus is now. For us, I think the wake-up moment was not so much the release of generative AI from the security perspective, but that was more of a progression through machine learning, convolutional networks, initial generative AI, until we ultimately get to things like ChatGPT, Gemini, and so on. It's really that moment where those agents start to interact with the world in some kind of meaningful way, and therefore create like some kind of meaningful outcome in reality, not like I'm giving you a suggestion, or I'm helping you with a presentation, or I'm getting some information more easily out of the system. But if we're actually going to have transactions, or, manage warehouses, or any business AI that would create a meaningful value, but also has a real outcome, right? Where in the past there was always a human that was making decisions. And of course, human in the loop is still important. So therefore also systems need to be designed so that only after the explicit approval of the human user, the human operator, that ultimately a decision is made. And at that point, maybe you don't really need an LLM anymore, right? I think one of my most fascinating scenarios is assembly of technology. Think like laptops and so on, right? You have a shell with a certain spec. You have a certain spec that you promise your line of that generation to do. But within that is quite a lot of variation, right? You may choose an AMD chip, you may use an Intel chip, but depending on which you choose, there's downstream dependencies. Now you need to have a motherboard that fits that particular chip, right? It still needs to also fit within the form factor of the laptop. So you end up with really complex bill of materials if you want to do things like just-in-time assembly. And you want to do that at, the best possible margin. So now you need to align like shipment, arrival times, how much you have in storage to keep your factory running, and how much you want to buy for a particular batch at a particular cost in a dependent BOM. Now that's a really challenging problem. That is definitely a good one for agentic AI to now figure out, like, how do I create 2, 3 scenarios that have, meet different evaluation criteria. This will get there faster. This is a little bit more expensive. This is, whatever the criteria may be. But that is where you may need reasoning models and large language models. But by the time you get to present the 3 different bombs, and the user clicks one or the other, you probably want to have a pretty deterministic process to now buy the one scenario so that you don't get an LLM messing up and buying parts of one pie, parts of the other, right? And I think that's where we have to get far smarter on where do we use what kind of model. The architectural pattern that Ron came up with, both for security, but governance, audit control points, but also even cost control, is to separate planning from execution.
Okay.
A lot of the times what people do is they use a reasoning model to plan, and they use that same model to then execute, which has a lot of really interesting flaws because it may not follow the plan that it created. And then it may report back success or failure when that wasn't the case. There's various examples for that. Reasoning models are good at planning, though, to figure out, like, hey, this is the path to accomplish this more complex task. If that's good, you can have it refined by another model or by a human to say, like, yes, that seemed to be a good course of action. You can then take these tasks one by one and hand them over to an executor to just do that particular task by yet another agent. But the executor can have controls in there because it has expectations what is going to come back. So you don't let that agent go off by itself and then feed it straight back to the user. It feeds it back to this executor, which can then again have very deterministic controls. So if it says, say this executor says, hey, discount bot, calculate a discount, but you can't exceed this or that particular limit. Answer comes back. Suppose it is over. Now the executive bot simply looks like what's the actual percentage of the discount compared to what's allowed and what I told it to do. The moment you now see that that didn't work, that it was excessive, you can either send it back. It's like, no, that's too much. Right. And maybe after 3 tries, you simply say, like, okay, never mind. I'm going to send it back to the user at the max. If he doesn't like that, come back to me and I refer him on to a human agent. So by separating that out, you create these control points. Moreover, that executor doesn't have to be that smart. It doesn't have to be a reasoning model. Some of the agents that are executing the task don't have to have a model behind it. Could also be quite deterministic if you actually know what it is that it's going to do, and therefore it doesn't need to be so unpredictable. We like the creativity where that makes sense. And then we need to contain the autonomy and the misbehavior it might have. But if we already know what it needs to do, why not just use a deterministic workflow and we don't incur the cost of, using an expensive model for that? So by decomposing your workflow and into these different tasks, you can figure out like which piece has to be the expensive part, which can be cheaper. Takes a little bit more engineering and you end up with multiple agents backed by a variety of different models. But in some cases, a small language model will actually perform better than a large language model or even Bayesian statistics, right? So by thinking through what makes sense and where some control or some freedom or some creativity would be more or less desirable, you end up building a far smarter solution, ultimately, vibe coding something and relying directly on a LLM to produce magic. There's at least one case that I heard where a team had vibe coded a set of dashboards and business metrics and found out after the executive board had made decisions accordingly that it had dreamt up like all of it was like just made up. In our case, none of that can ever happen, right? So we have to make sure we get it right. And ultimately, we're going back to, the core of general ledger, right? Like, how many cents behind the decimal point do we need to get right to ultimately create a reliable financial report?
So why did you say it will never happen in our world? Is it the grounding and the architecture and kind of things we are using versus?
That's right. And I'm not saying it can't never happen. I'm not,
Yeah.
but we try to do what we can to keep these things grounded, to keep it from doing things that it's not supposed to do, and create, how do you call it, fail safes or fail safely, where you just get to a point where maybe the system can't figure this problem out. Right? You can do a retry, but the more retries you do, the more expensive the solution comes. And in some scenarios, you may simply, with either a smaller model or with a deterministic component, correct the output from an agentic agent, right? That's, I think, the point. We need to find a way to, on the one hand, make use of the creativity and value that business AI brings, but stop it from misbehaving, stepping out of line, stepping out of context and try to answer about things that have nothing to do with it. That's not even content filters for using nasty words, but why would you comment on, say, salaries of your co-employees when you're trying to book travel, right? That's completely out of context of a legitimate business scenario. And that again goes back to try to be as concrete as possible of the things that you're going to do as a customer in adoption of AI solution or development of your and in case of our development efforts within the different lines of businesses and solutions to tie these things together, either within one application or even workflows that cross applications, as will be coming soon.
So I guess I had I think the grounding and the identity as its core, the way kind of the whole AI business AI or the Joule has been implemented. But I want to know more about, like, as a customer, that's like on the SAP's share responsibility model. So you're doing everything on your side to make sure we're doing our part there. But as a customer, suppose I'm going on this business AI and Joule journey, I want to know two things. Maybe just as a generally kind of a like a guidelines what I should be doing as a customer, and second, maybe just somebody like me, a security guy who may not be. I think some part we have seen like we are not on the table, right? So what we as a kind of a security community should be doing to make sure this AI is implemented in a secure way as we should. So I want to hear those kind of two responses. Like as a customer, generally kind of a guidelines, anything we should be thinking, learning, or talking to SAP and experts, and then maybe somebody like a security guys. Like what's our role?
Yeah. I would distinguish a bit between user scenarios and administrator or developer scenarios. If you're a user, your employee, or it's a solution exposed externally, then of course a lot of it will be done for you. You just now have a Joule button in your application and you can interact with Joule from within the application or store front end. Then you're probably not really thinking about this and you just need some level of reassurance that an agent is acting on your behalf within the context of your access rights. As an administrator, you
So
need
that's
to.
examples like a Joule in Ariba or Joule in
Exactly right.
Concur.
Where essentially the information comes from business connectors that federate your identity into those systems. One
Okay.
thing that we are working on, and this is actually remarkably complex and also interesting to security people, is we'd like to drop privileges within the context of that user as long as they're not needed yet. Suppose I'm in Ariba. I have access to a particular catalog that I can pick from. I can choose things and I can click a button to send that to my manager, right? What if you can earlier in these tasks, right? So in an agentic task, we created now through the reasoning model, a set of tasks, but only the last one really says like, click that transaction button for me. For the beginning, it's like, search for me something that meets my criteria. It's just a catalog search. So what we want to do is two things. First of all, make sure that it's always marked that if there's a user that it says agent acting on behalf of user, right? So that we can distinguish from what the user clicked or did in the application versus what the agent did. But the second piece is, can we drop those user privileges selectively? Now, in security, we've always kind of done it the other way around, where you maybe get a periodic elevation of privileges, right? But how do you drop it and
Okay.
then only allow the transaction privileges of the user where it matters? So This is actually a remarkably different, difficult challenge, but we're working through that so that you can further prevent any kind of misbehavior by an agent where they kind of moved ahead of the plan in some way.
Okay. So the dropping thing, like why you will drop it? Like I still didn't get the whole, like in this scenario, like
So
if I'm on Ariba and using
say
Joule,
we
it's
have a
using.
scenario that says, like, look for me in a catalog for things that meet a certain criteria, right?
Okay.
And present me the top three and give me recommendations about why you think I should pick any of those three, right? I get something back to me and then maybe ask further questions and then I pick one of those three. And only at that point, should there be a transaction that says Jay wants that particular product, now execute that and wait for my manager's approval to say that that's okay and fits indeed within my budget. But for the steps before, the agent didn't need that transaction right. All it needed to be able to do is read the catalog. So if we only issue privileges that are read only, and even read only for the catalog, that takes it even a step further, then it's still within the context of the access right the user has already been defined by, but you're basically selectively dropping privileges rather than selectively adding privileges because of some escalation or a particular action that requires you to do a further authentication, right? So figuring out how to do user delegation, but drop privileges from that, that's a different way of thinking of, application security design.
Got
So
it.
we're kind of thinking we might do something like copy the role for that user and then like start removing things in there. But yeah, we're still early days trying to figure that out, and that becomes especially important once you start talking about cross-application scenarios.
Yeah. So that's a business AI. We just heard Aribas and Concurs,
That's
but
right, and now we're
it's
getting
still
it really
within.
that's
Okay.
really when you get into agentic AI. When I said developers and as a result
Administrators.
also
Yeah.
admins, is when you start building yourself.
Okay.
Because it's one thing if, you have a big organization like ourselves where you can set architecture patterns and enforce them, validate them with all the processes around it before you get to a release. Of course, if as a user of the platform, building your own things on that platform, you have the capabilities to do all of those things. But if you decide, like, you know what, I'm just going to do a mass export without data masking of my customer database, throw it directly into Gemini and hope magic ensues, you can do that, right? So I think one of the key reasons why we're being open of how we approach this, both from an architectural perspective, good operational practices, etc., that we can also prevent our customers from making poor decisions. For instance, through the retrieval augmented generation that we talked about before, through HANA as a vector database, you can upload all kinds of source documents that are not coming from SAP systems into the landscape and train models on that. Or ideally, what we would recommend, bring it in, see what fields can be anonymized as you can bring that in, or whether you want to use it specifically for grounding and therefore not load it into an LLM, but load it into HANA. So that then when you want to ask questions, you ask the LLM, retrieval augmented generation, get data from the real documents and bring that back. If for the use LLM doesn't behave well, then train also on those documents, but again, anonymize them. So essentially, we're trying to share our best practices in the hope that you will do the same.
So I guess that RAG and the grounding you mentioned, again, thinking from the cyber security side. So if I have my policies, I can actually have that as like a grounding too, right? Like these are the controls, like don't go beyond, like make sure you're something we can do that as well. Like this is like everything starts from policy, right? Like this is the organization
That's right.
policy.
I think the key thing to remember is that unless we're talking about some external service where it doesn't matter what kind of access right it is, you're just a member of a service, a weather service. You plug in an API key, who the hell cares? You know, whether you're asking for the weather in Hong Kong in January 27 or, you know, New York City yesterday, right? Like those don't require access rights. But essentially, always leverage the access and governance that already exists within SAP systems. And of course, if we're talking about external databases, for instance, through BDC, like Snowflake, Databricks, or BigQuery, that also works through federations. Now you need to make sure that whatever user is passed along has the access rights on that data source applied as well. I mean, a lot of the same security principles that apply everywhere, right? Sometimes we think that new technology, everything's different, but it's still about like IAM, access management, privilege access management, posture management, vulnerabilities, software supply chain, and third party risk to make sure that you evaluate and understand what it is that these solutions are doing and how they're constrained and governed. And if you actually have reliable auditing control points. One of the interesting thing of that plan then execute is that you create a, a choke point, if you like, in that executor of where you can most reliably audit. Because that's what the thing is. Like, this is what I'm going to do, and this was the outcome of that, right? By delegating that work then to other agents, because you want to make sure that you ultimately have a true record of what happened and that matches the transaction logs in your business systems as well.
I think I do want to again ask the question again, like what I should be doing as a security or somebody responsible for securing SAP. Is it something I should be learning today, doing today to make sure I kind of, because this seems like a lot to absorb if you're
A
not.
lot of it is to absorb, but it's also a bit like just ask SAP to explain it to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Like by taking you as a customer through how we built these things, you gain more trust into what's actually happening behind the scenes and whether you rely on it or not. Right? Like as long as you come in going like, oh my God, I have to secure AI, that gets a lot of that gets demystified when you say like, yeah, but all of these use cases really are delegating the user access directly through business connectors. And it's like, so my existing access control is honored? Yes. Okay, then a lot of stuff falls away. You realize that with a good GRC practice, you're probably already a good way there. And you can even tell your auditor that, like, yes, access to business AI is governed by the same governance, risk, and compliance that you already see here. That's why I wanted to make the distinction between essentially buying and adopting SAP Business AI versus doing your own projects on AI core glued together with BTP, extracting data or bringing in email, PDF documents, invoice documents, and so on that are not already part of the SAP system.
So I heard talk to your SAP experts. Yeah, you cannot do this alone. So make sure you're using your
There's
security
pretty good
experts on SAP side.
documentation
Yeah, and
online
good.
as well, but I also understand that some that can be a little bit inaccessible without having somebody talk you at least through some of the basics of that, but specifically an understanding of what Joule is, how does it hit that orchestration layer, the operational practices also described through ISO 42001, the first real consequential audit framework for responsible AI, and all the contractual agreements that we have, but also you may have yourself with suppliers. I think in general, I'm coming to the opinion that everybody should do a lot more supplier and third-party risk management, because if your supplier does it well, then a lot of the concerns you may have get demystified. We can have the same conversation about actually understanding how RISE works, right? Versus first coming in and being unclear about the shared responsibility boundaries and what do I do? What does SAP do? And is it still covered in a way that I, as a customer, find acceptable? And I think, especially with something that's going so fast as AI, and where, frankly, there's a lot of hype and noise that might distract you from what actually is going on. A lot of vendors that want to have their offerings appear far smarter than perhaps they are. Sometimes it's better to actually figure out, like, what does these things really do? How do they handle access to private and confidential data? And like, how much does this solution rely on LLMs versus other models? I'm not even saying bigger models is more dangerous. Bigger models, when applied well in the right use cases, have a lot of value, but not if you're using them to, let's say, do the end calculation of the bill of materials and hope that it got the math right, right?
So I think you talk about some hype and other things. So I want to ask that funny question, which at least I'm told by and I hear a lot is like, we have only few years left before the AI takes over all the jobs and will not be either we don't need to work or will not even have jobs. So what's your take on that, Janos? Maybe a sound like a
I find
controversial
that,
thing, but what's
like,
your take on that?
look, let's be realistic. There's definitely going to be areas that are more affected by the impact of AI. I'm always hoping that that's the most boring aspect of people's jobs. The amount of time that is wasted on just getting the right people across different time zones together on the same call. I wish I had an AI to figure that one out and would randomly reschedule if somebody can't make it, right? Like, the amount of time that gets wasted on simple business processes that requires actually way too much intelligence to get right because they're really difficult to figure out. I think that's where AI can be fantastic. I think where AI becomes more difficult is in things that are both have, like, real strategic consequences and where things are basically new. I think we find ourselves in a world that is very unpredictable. And I think AI is good to say is like, hey, given a certain challenge, figure me out a new trade route and a set of new suppliers, right? But to actually sit there and make the decision is like, okay, but there are consequences to making those choices. Do I, get rid of a very loyal supplier just because he's in a geography that's under threat, or do I hold on for a little longer and find a temporary solution, right? Do you find yourself what makes you special as an organization, even in an industry you can't get out of AI that will ultimately have to come out of the creativity of the people, whether it's tribal knowledge, this or the other, but ultimately human judgment. And that can be assisted by AI, but I don't think AI can replace it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's enable and empower people to be able to spend more time on honestly thinking through a problem. I think that's what we often have too little time for. We go from call to call to call, do a process, go into a system here and there. What if we can have a lot of that done by business AI so that we can actually spend like 2 hours, absorbing the news, a sales report and this, that, and the other and go like, what the heck are we going to do? Right? Like, I could actually see people spending more times in meetings and absorbing a larger amount of information to ultimately then come to better decisions rather than AI simply spitting out in some unexplainable ways like, this optimizes for that problem. Oh, all right, let's throw the dice and AI says so. Let's do it. I'm hoping that as humans, we're enabled by an AI and have actually more time to reflect than we have at the moment, and therefore end up with better decisions, better consequences. There's many ways of looking at this, but honestly, nobody really knows.
Yeah, yeah, we all are figuring it out. I know it's time. We probably will do a follow up with Ron if he can join. Jay,
Yeah.
any last, I would say, anybody listening? Again, I try to say one is maybe customer, maybe one is like somebody like me as a practitioner or a consultant in our SAP world, or maybe for our SAP security and SAP cybersecurity, which we try to call ourselves out. Any key takeaways or things we should be doing
I
today?
will sort of highlight two big points that we covered earlier, but I want to make sure that they don't get lost. First of all, is threat model your concrete AI business use cases, right? That will, like, not just the technical layer, but actually what are the business outcomes that could come from this? And imagine, like, what if the agent misbehaves and oversteps boundaries? Right? That, I think, has been for us the most productive way of looking at it so that you can realistically understand the true consequences of when it goes wrong rather than imagined. We can have a prompt injection. Fine. What's that mean for this particular system? And the second one, and related, is consider your agents misbehaving on non-malicious input, right? Either because they take initiative of their own or because they try to aim the request, a legitimate request from a user. As humans, we have judgment, right? Going back to sort of buyer seller scenario. You might poke me, like, give me extra discount, we're such good buddies. Already knowing that if we have a good relationship, if I don't want to give it to you, I was like, oh man, you're always trying, right? So you have that inbuilt control. If we replace one end with a bot, but we encourage that same kind of human interaction, we need to cater for that. And no sentiment analysis, this, that, and the other can replace, you and I looking each other in the eye as I'm kind of joking around, right? But that kind of joking around is going to happen, and it's clearly not malicious intent, right? We need to have these agents behave in a similar smart way where you still maintain the controls, but you don't like make everybody annoyed to the point where it's like, I hate interacting with your bot, so I'm just going to go back to the original tool, or I'm just going to call my account.
Any resources? I know you. I think we'll share the blog series you and I think Ron both co-wrote. So we'll share that for our audience. Any other resources our audience should be referring to? Learning this SAP AI kind of standard documentations.
There is actually, just look for SAP Business AI and Responsible AI. There's a
Okay.
pretty good section that goes into quite a lot of detail. And when you click through, you get into documents and documentation and so on. You can get a little lost in there quite quickly.
Okay. Yeah. Nothing can beat. I think this SAP's documentation, which is amazing as always. Okay. So we'll share those links as well, Jay. And if you have questions, you want to talk to my friend, the magician with the hat on, hit him on LinkedIn. You're open on LinkedIn, right? So people can reach out to
Indeed.
you if they have questions. Okay. Thank you, Jay, again, coming from the show and sharing your insights, your knowledge, the stories about the buyers and the discount. And we didn't go deep dive into that whole blog thing. Maybe hopefully we can do next episode with Ron. Any last comment before I let you go?
Thanks so much for having me, Gaurav. It was a pleasure again.
Thank you. I take care, Jay. See you.